Bella, thank you very much for joining me. As I said in the open to this podcast, I know this is a really challenging and difficult topic for a lot of people. And so I really want to get into it and kind of unpack the concerns people have with it, but also the reasons why it's so important to be having this conversation about conscious language in the first place. Obviously, you had this idea, or you and your team had this idea to put together a conscious language guide. Those millions of readers who you have each month, is it a policy of Healthline Media that you must use certain terms and not use other terms? Is the guide exactly that, something that should guide their thinking and that people should remain mindful of? How do you see that?
The guide initially started as an internal resource for our editorial folks to aid in editorial judgment when looking through content and making changes and making edits. It's not designed to be prescriptive. So it's not designed to say you must use this word or you must not use this word, because context is really important and it depends on who you're talking to or who you're talking about. And those considerations have to be, top of mind when deciding what kinds of words and terms and phrasing should be used when talking about a specific health topic. So it's not designed to tell people what to say or how to speak. That wouldn't be our place anyway. And it really came from Healthline has a great foundation for empathy, person first, and a whole person approach. And this was just kind of an extension of that as well. And I would really be amiss not to give a huge thanks to all of our editorial folks out there who are implementing not only our style guides, but the conscious language guide in all of our content every day. I have to give a shout out to them for their work in the actual implementation of the guide.
What was the origin story of this? What made you personally, but also as a group, decide that you wanted to create this conscious language guide, which you've referred to as the first digital guide of its kind for consumers and health professionals?
So if I'm being honest, we realized that we could do better. I think we started doing a lot of internal reflection, specifically around racism and health, and how there's a lot of I'm going to use the term scientific racism, right? And so we pride ourselves on using research, scientific sources, but we also have to acknowledge that these don't come without bias. And so how do we make sure that when we're writing content based on these like trusted sources, that we're not translating racial bias into our content? And so this was like a huge catalyst for us to think about other bias that might also be in our content as well. And also just implementing best practice for health communication. I have a public health background, and so I'm really invested in health communication, how we do that effectively and efficiently. So it draws on a lot of different places to think about how all of these isms might show up in health information and how we're not doing our part in like perpetuating any of that, because it can really have a detrimental effect on marginalized communities. And we really want to work towards health equity in what we're doing.
I'm curious if you could give an example of how that unconscious bias can show up in some of your content. In ways, as you said, it's unconscious, it's not intentional, and yet it might have a negative impact.
For sure. So one example that comes to mind is listing African American as a risk factor for a condition. So for example, if we are talking about diabetes and then, we have a list of risk factors, sometimes you might see African American listed as a risk factor for diabetes. What this does is it places the onus on like an individual body being responsible for that condition or that outcome. And what it doesn't take into account is the context in which people live, the systems around them that influence health. And so instead of putting African American in a risk factor for diabetes, we have started to make that change and saying like socioeconomic factors contribute to the prevalence of diabetes, and it may be more common in some groups than others. So instead of focusing on the individual, it takes kind of like a broader look at the places people live, the systems in which they, work and play and worship, to understand a little bit more of how people's health behavior influenced by all of this.
Thanks for watching this video clip of the Speak Good podcast. If you'd like to hear the complete episode, please check out your favorite podcast directory and subscribe now. Thanks for watching.